The hardest part about losing a child isn't always death. Sometimes it's watching them choose a new family and slowly erase you from their life while you're still alive. I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at the birthday cake I bought for myself at Jewel Asco that morning, a small vanilla cake with pale pink frosting and the number 67 written in shaky icing because the teenage bakery girl looked nervous when she handed it to me. The candles had already melted into little puddles by the time the clock above my stove hit 11:43 p.m. My phone never rang. Not once. I kept telling myself Daniel was busy. Maybe he forgot the time. Maybe he was driving home. Maybe he was planning to surprise me. Mothers become experts at lying to themselves when their children stop loving them the same way. Outside my kitchen window, the November rain tapped softly against the glass while the porch light glowed over an empty driveway. I remember pulling my cardigan tighter around my shoulders because the house suddenly felt too big for one person. It hadn't always been this quiet. When Daniel was little, birthdays were a full event in our home. Pancakes in the morning. Balloons tied to chairs. Music playing from the old radio, while he danced around the kitchen in superhero pajamas. Even after he became an adult, he never missed my birthday. Not once. When his father died from a stroke 12 years earlier, Daniel held my hand at the funeral and promised me I would never be alone. "You've got me, Mom," he told me back then. I believed him with my whole heart. And for a long time, he kept that promise. Every Sunday morning, like clockwork, he called around 9 o'clock while making coffee. He'd stop by after work, just to change a light bulb, or carry in groceries I could have managed myself. He brought me soup when I caught pneumonia one winter. He sat beside me through 2 terrifying hospital visits after my blood pressure spiked. My son used to look at me like I mattered. Then he married Megan. The strange thing is, Megan never seemed openly cruel. If anything, she was polished. Perfect teeth. Soft voice. Expensive beige sweaters that somehow always looked freshly steamed. She hugged lightly, like someone careful not to wrinkle their clothes. At the wedding reception outside Naperville, she smiled at me while thanking guests for coming, but even then I noticed something cold in her eyes whenever Daniel paid attention to me for too long. Little things changed first. Sunday calls became every other week. Then once a month. Then silence. Invitations stopped coming. If I texted Daniel asking if they wanted dinner, he'd answer hours later with short replies that sounded nothing like the boy who once told me everything. "Busy weekend, Mom. Maybe next time." We already made plans. It was always plans. Plans with Megan's co-workers. Plans with her family. Plans that somehow never included me anymore. I tried not to take it personally. That's what older women do in America. We shrink ourselves to avoid looking needy. We pretend independence is empowering even when loneliness is swallowing us whole. My friends at church would say things like, "That's just marriage, Evelyn," or "Young couples need space." So I smiled and nodded and acted mature, while going home to eat dinner alone 4 nights a week. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Daniel no longer sounded relaxed when he talked to me. Sometimes I could practically hear Megan in the background before he rushed off the phone. Once, when I asked if they were coming for Thanksgiving, he paused long enough for my stomach to sink before saying, "We might spend it with Megan's parents this year." Might? That word sat in my chest for weeks. At exactly 11:58 p.m. that night, my phone finally lit up. My heart jumped so fast I almost knocked over my coffee mug reaching for it. But it wasn't Daniel. It was a notification from Facebook. Someone had tagged him in photos from a rooftop cocktail bar in downtown Chicago. I stared at the screen while my son smiled beside his wife under glowing string lights, one arm wrapped around her waist, a drink in his hand, looking happier than I'd seen him in years. Megan wore a silver dress and laughed into the camera, while Daniel leaned close beside her like he didn't have a mother sitting alone on her birthday waiting for a call that never came. I don't know how long I sat there looking at those pictures, but I remember one thought settling over me so quietly it almost scared me. That was the night I realized my son had not simply grown up. He had moved on from me completely. The worst kind of rejection is the kind that happens slowly enough for you to keep hoping things will go back to normal. 4 weeks after my birthday, I kept replaying those photos in my mind while pretending they did not hurt me. I would wash dishes and suddenly picture Daniel laughing beside Megan under those rooftop lights. I would fold laundry and wonder if he had even remembered what day it was before someone tagged him online. The silence between us started feeling heavier than grief, because grief at least comes with certainty. This felt like standing outside a locked door waiting for someone to let me back in. December arrived early that year in Illinois, bringing freezing rain and gray skies that made the afternoons feel like evening by 4 o'clock. One Saturday morning, I drove to the grocery store and saw Daniel's favorite cereal on sale. Without thinking, I reached for 2 boxes before stopping myself halfway down the aisle. It sounds foolish now, but mothers never really stop shopping like their children might come home at any moment. I put the second box back and stood there staring at it longer than I should have. That afternoon, I called Daniel for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I tried to sound cheerful anyway. "Hi sweetheart, it is Mom. I was just checking in. The weather report said we might get snow tonight, so drive carefully. Call me when you get a chance." He never called back. 2 days later, I saw on social media that he and Megan had spent the weekend at a ski resort in Wisconsin with another couple. It became a pattern after that. I would learn about my son's life through photographs posted online by strangers. New restaurants. Wine tastings. Weekend trips. Smiling faces around tables where there was never an empty chair for me. The painful part was not just that Daniel seemed happier without me. It was realizing how easy it had become for him to forget I existed at all. Megan had a way of making exclusion feel polished and reasonable. Around Christmas, she sent me a text message that said, "We are trying to simplify the holidays this year, so we are keeping things very low-key." Low-key apparently meant spending Christmas Eve with her parents in Lake Forest while I sat alone in my living room watching old Hallmark movies with the television volume turned up too loud just to fill the silence. Daniel used to sleep on the couch every Christmas morning after staying up late helping me wrap presents for charity drives at church. He used to complain about my egg casserole while eating 3 servings anyway. That year, I ate reheated soup by myself while snow piled against the windows outside. Still, I kept making excuses for him because that is what mothers do when their hearts are breaking. I told myself marriage changes people. I told myself young couples need boundaries. I told myself Megan probably came from a different kind of family. But deep down, I started noticing things I had ignored before. The way Daniel glanced at Megan before answering simple questions whenever we were together. The way she corrected him in front of people with a tight little smile. The way conversations always shifted whenever I mentioned family traditions or old memories. It was as if my entire existence reminded her that she had not been there first. In February, Daniel finally invited me to dinner at their townhouse in Naperville. I spent an hour deciding what to wear, because I felt nervous seeing my own son. That realization alone nearly broke my heart. I brought a homemade peach cobbler, because Daniel used to beg me to make it every summer growing up. When Megan opened the door, she smiled politely without warmth. "Oh, you did not have to bring anything," she said, though her tone made it sound more like a criticism than gratitude. During dinner, Daniel barely looked up from his phone while Megan talked about networking events and luxury apartment developments outside Chicago. Halfway through the meal, I mentioned that the church women's group was organizing meal deliveries for seniors recovering from surgery. Megan laughed softly and said, "That generation really depends on each other for everything, huh?" I do not think she meant for it to sound cruel. That was what made it sting even more. Daniel stayed silent. He just kept eating while I sat there realizing my son no longer defended me because somewhere along the line, he had stopped seeing me as someone worth protecting. By spring, I started understanding something painful about modern families. Nobody has to scream at you to push you out of their life anymore. They just stop making room for you. Little by little, your chair disappears from the table until one day everybody acts like it was never there to begin with. March in Illinois is always ugly. The snow turns gray along the sidewalks, trees look half dead, and the cold hangs around long after everyone is tired of winter. One afternoon, I drove nearly 40 minutes through traffic to attend Daniel's company charity fundraiser, because he had mentioned weeks earlier that it might be nice if I came. Those exact words stayed with me longer than they should have, because when your child starts withholding affection, even tiny invitations begin to feel precious. I spent 2 hours getting ready that evening. I curled my hair carefully, wore my navy blue dress with the pearl earrings my late husband bought me on our 20th anniversary, and even practiced smiling in the mirror so I would not look lonely. The event was held at an upscale hotel ballroom outside downtown Chicago. Everything smelled faintly of expensive perfume and catered food. Women in fitted dresses carried wine glasses, while men in tailored suits laughed too loudly near the bar. I spotted Daniel almost immediately across the room. My heart lifted for half a second the way it always used to when I saw my son. But when I walked toward him, something strange happened. Megan touched his arm before he noticed me. She leaned close and whispered something into his ear. I watched his expression change instantly, like someone dimming a light switch. Then he gave me a polite smile instead of the warm one I remembered from years ago. "Mom, hey," he said quickly, giving me a brief hug with one arm while glancing back toward his co-workers. "I did not know if you were actually coming." Actually coming. As if I was some distant acquaintance instead of the woman who raised him. Megan air-kissed my cheek without making real contact. "You look nice, Evelyn," she said before immediately turning back toward another couple standing nearby. For most of the evening, I stood alone pretending to study silent auction baskets while watching my son laugh with people who barely knew him. Twice I approached Daniel to start conversations, and twice Megan smoothly redirected him somewhere else. Once to meet a client. Another time to take photos with friends. None of it was openly rude. That was what made it impossible to explain to anyone else. There are people who slam doors in your face, and then there are people who quietly close them while smiling the entire time. Near the end of the evening, I overheard Megan speaking to another woman near the dessert table. "Daniel is finally learning boundaries with family," she said softly while adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. "Some parents become emotionally dependent on their children, and it is honestly unhealthy." I froze so completely I could hear my own heartbeat. She never said my name. She did not need to. The other woman nodded sympathetically, like Megan was describing some difficult burden she had bravely learned to manage. I stood there holding a paper plate with untouched cheesecake, while humiliation crawled slowly up my neck. In that moment, I realized Megan had been telling a story about me long before I ever understood one was being written. Suddenly everything made sense. The distance. The coldness. The careful politeness. Somewhere behind closed doors, I had become the needy mother. The clingy widow who could not let go of her son. And Daniel, instead of defending me, had allowed that version of me to become real inside his marriage. I left the fundraiser early without saying goodbye. Rain streaked across my windshield during the drive home, while old songs played softly through the radio speakers. About 15 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed through the car's Bluetooth system. For one hopeful second, I thought Daniel might actually be calling to check if I got home safely. Instead, it was a text message from Megan. "Thanks for coming tonight. Daniel gets overwhelmed socially, so I hope you understand if he seemed distracted." I stared at the message at a red light, while something inside me finally began to crack. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like ice melting after a long winter. Because for the first time, I stopped asking myself whether Megan disliked me. The truth was much simpler than that. She did not see me as part of their life anymore. And worse than that, my own son had started agreeing with her. After that fundraiser, something inside me changed in a way I could not fully explain at first. I stopped expecting warmth from Daniel every time my phone buzzed. I stopped rehearsing cheerful conversations in my head before calling him. It was not anger exactly. It was exhaustion. There is only so long a person can keep reaching for someone who keeps stepping further away. But even then, a part of me still held on to hope, because hope is stubborn in mothers, especially the ones who spent decades putting family before themselves. By late October, grocery stores across Illinois had already filled with Thanksgiving displays. Artificial pumpkins. Cinnamon candles. Turkeys advertised at impossible prices. Everywhere I looked, families were smiling from magazine covers and store windows, and every image felt like a reminder of what I no longer had. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. Even after my husband passed away, I kept hosting because Daniel loved tradition. He loved my herb stuffing and homemade cranberry bread. He used to joke that nobody could make mashed potatoes like me. So despite everything that had happened, I convinced myself this year could still be different. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I called Daniel while standing in the produce section at the grocery store. "I was thinking about dinner plans," I said carefully. "I wanted to make sure I buy enough for everyone." There was a pause long enough for me to hear people talking in the background near him. Then he said, "We are not totally sure yet, Mom. Megan's parents mentioned maybe hosting too." Maybe. That word again. I forced a laugh. "Well, just let me know by the weekend, sweetheart. You know I like to prepare early." "Yeah, of course," he answered quickly before ending the call less than a minute later. Still, I prepared anyway because hope can make intelligent women act foolish. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I woke up before sunrise to start cooking. I peeled 10 pounds of potatoes while the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade replayed old performances on television. By noon, my kitchen smelled like roasted turkey and brown sugar glaze. I set out my late husband's favorite serving dishes and ironed the good tablecloth with the tiny embroidered leaves around the edges. I even placed 3 small pumpkins in the center of the dining table because Megan once mentioned liking minimalist fall decorations. Looking back now, that detail embarrasses me the most. The way I kept trying to become easier to love. Around 4 in the afternoon, I texted Daniel asking what time they planned to arrive. No response. At 5:30, I checked my phone again. Nothing. By then the turkey was resting under foil, the rolls were warming in the oven, and 6 place settings sat untouched around the dining room table. Outside, the sky had already turned dark blue with cold November wind rattling the tree branches against the house. At exactly 6:07 p.m., my phone finally buzzed. I smiled automatically before reading the message. "Hey Mom. Last minute change. We decided to stay with Megan's family tonight. Sorry. We will catch up another time." That was it. No phone call. No explanation. No apology that sounded real. Just 12 words tossed into my lap like crumbs. I sat there staring at the message while the entire house went silent around me. The television still played softly in the living room, but suddenly even that sounded far away. I remember looking at the dining table and noticing one small detail that nearly broke me completely. I had folded Daniel's napkin the way I always used to when he was little, shaped neatly like a triangle because he once told me it looked fancy. I do not know how long I sat there before finally standing up and putting the food away by myself. Plastic containers filled the refrigerator shelf by shelf while tears blurred my vision so badly I nearly dropped the gravy boat into the sink. Around 8 o'clock, I made myself a small plate and ate alone at the kitchen counter because sitting at the full dining room table felt unbearable. Halfway through dinner, I opened Facebook without even thinking. The first photo I saw was Megan smiling beside her mother while Daniel carved turkey in the background, wearing the same navy sweater I bought him 2 Christmases earlier. Everyone looked warm, comfortable, complete. And suddenly I understood something painful with absolute clarity. My son was not too busy for family. He had simply decided which family mattered more. There comes a moment in every heartbreak when survival quietly becomes more important than hope. Mine happened 3 days after Thanksgiving while I was standing in my kitchen staring at containers of untouched leftovers that nobody came to eat. I suddenly realized I could spend the rest of my life waiting for scraps of attention from my own son, or I could finally stop humiliating myself trying to hold onto someone who had already let go. That realization did not make me angry. Oddly enough, it made me calm. The following Sunday morning, I woke up out of habit expecting Daniel's weekly call before remembering he had not called regularly in almost a year. Usually I would sit near my phone anyway, pretending not to wait while secretly listening for it to ring. That morning, I carried my coffee to the back porch instead. The air smelled cold and sharp, and frost coated the wooden railing in thin white lines. For the first time in months, I let myself enjoy the silence instead of fearing it. Over the next few weeks, I stopped initiating contact. No more checking in. No more asking if they wanted dinner. No more carefully worded text messages designed to sound casual enough not to bother them. At first it felt unnatural, like quitting an addiction. I would reach for my phone after seeing something Daniel might like at the hardware store, then stop myself halfway through typing a message. I started noticing how much emotional energy I had wasted trying to stay connected to someone who contributed almost nothing back. One afternoon in January, my neighbor Linda invited me to a pottery class at the community center in Downers Grove. Normally I would have declined because I always kept weekends open in case Daniel suddenly wanted to visit. But this time, without overthinking it, I said yes. The class smelled like clay and coffee, and most of the women there were around my age. Divorced women. Widows. Grandmothers. Women who had learned how lonely aging in America could feel once children built lives that no longer revolved around family. Nobody there pretended everything was perfect. Nobody acted embarrassed about loneliness. For 2 hours, we sat shaping crooked bowls while talking about books, recipes, old vacations, and aching knees. I laughed more that afternoon than I had in months. Slowly, my world started widening again. I repainted my bedroom a soft sage green instead of the dull beige it had been since my husband died. I joined a walking group at church on Tuesday mornings. I even booked a weekend bus trip to Michigan with a senior travel club, after nearly canceling 3 separate times out of guilt. Somewhere along the way, I stopped structuring my entire existence around whether my son might suddenly remember me. The strange thing was, the less I chased Daniel, the more clearly I began seeing the truth about our relationship. It had become entirely one-sided. When I stopped reaching out, weeks passed without a single word from him. Then a month. By early March, even the silence stopped shocking me. It simply became reality. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was reorganizing old photo albums in the living room when my phone suddenly rang. My heart jumped so quickly it annoyed me. Even after everything, part of me still reacted like that whenever I saw Daniel's name on the screen. I answered carefully. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hey, Mom," he said distractedly. I could hear car noises in the background. "Sorry, I have been busy lately." "Busy? Always busy." "That is all right," I answered quietly. There was a short pause before he spoke again. "Listen, Megan and I probably cannot make it to Easter this year either. Her parents already planned something." I almost laughed from the sheer predictability of it. He had not called because he missed me. He had called to cancel plans nobody had officially made in the first place. But something surprising happened then. Instead of feeling devastated, I simply felt tired. Deeply tired. "That is fine, Daniel," I said calmly. "You should do what works best for you." He sounded caught off guard by my tone. "You are not upset?" I looked around my freshly painted living room, at the pottery bowl drying near the window, at my packed overnight bag sitting by the stairs for the Michigan trip the next morning. Then I realized something important. My life no longer paused waiting for his attention. "No," I answered honestly. "I think I am finally getting used to things." After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment staring at the rain sliding down the windows. For the first time in a very long time, I understood that acceptance does not always arrive with tears. Sometimes it arrives with peace. Life became quieter after that, but it also became lighter. Summer arrived slowly in Illinois, bringing humid mornings and long golden evenings that stretched past 8 o'clock. I started planting flowers in the backyard again, for the first time since my husband died. Lavender. White petunias. Small rose bushes near the fence line. There was something healing about caring for things that still wanted to grow. Some mornings I drove with Linda and the other women from church to a diner outside Aurora for pancakes and coffee. Other weekends, I took pottery workshops or wandered through farmers' markets listening to live music played by college kids trying to earn extra money during summer break. My life was not glamorous, but it was peaceful. More importantly, it finally belonged to me again. Daniel rarely called. Sometimes weeks passed without hearing his voice at all. Oddly enough, once I stopped begging for closeness, his absence stopped controlling my mood. I no longer checked social media wondering what holidays or dinners I had been excluded from. I no longer stared at my phone hoping for invitations that never came. Somewhere along the way, acceptance settled into me fully. Not bitterness. Just clarity. Then one night in late September, everything changed. A thunderstorm had rolled through around dinner time, knocking tree branches across several roads and leaving the neighborhood slick with rain. I had just finished watching an old movie when my phone rang at 11:42 p.m. The sound startled me because almost nobody called that late anymore. When I saw Daniel's name on the screen, a strange feeling passed through me. Not excitement. Not panic. Just instinct. Mothers always know when something is wrong with their children, no matter how distant they become. I answered immediately. "Daniel." For a second, all I heard was breathing. Then his voice came through low and tired. "Hey, Mom." Something in his tone made me sit up straighter on the couch. "What happened?" Another pause. "Nothing serious," he said too quickly. "I just wanted to talk for a minute." Outside, thunder rumbled softly across the sky while rain tapped against the windows. I waited quietly because suddenly I remembered the version of Daniel who used to call me whenever life overwhelmed him. "Megan lost her job today," he finally admitted. The room went still around me. Megan had worked for a corporate marketing firm downtown for years. Her career had always seemed polished and stable from the outside. Expensive work trips, networking dinners, designer handbags, carefully curated photos online that made their life look flawless. "Oh," I said gently. "I am sorry to hear that." He let out a long breath. "The company did layoffs. Apparently they have been struggling for months." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Daniel started talking faster, the way people do when they are trying to hold themselves together. Mortgage payments, rising interest rates, credit card debt, car loans, medical insurance. I listened quietly while realizing something surprising. Their beautiful life had been balancing on a very fragile foundation the entire time. "Things are just tight right now," he admitted carefully. "A lot tighter than we expected." I looked around my small living room, with its thrift store lamp and second-hand bookshelf, and suddenly remembered all the subtle ways Megan had once made my simpler life seem outdated. The church dinners, the old furniture, the modest house paid off years ago by careful budgeting and sacrifice. Funny how quickly practicality becomes valuable again when money disappears. "Are you both all right?" I asked softly. "Yeah," he answered automatically before hesitating. "Well, not really." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for the first time in years, he sounded young again. Not like the polished husband Megan presented to the world. "Just my son. Tired. Scared. Human." "Mom," he said after another long silence, "would it be okay if we came by sometime this weekend?" There it was. The shift. Quiet but unmistakable. Months of silence. Missed birthdays. Ignored holidays. Distance carefully maintained like a wall between us. And now suddenly, at nearly midnight during a financial crisis, my phone was ringing again. I wish I could say I felt triumphant in that moment, but the truth was sadder than that. I mostly felt tired. Because deep down, I already knew they were not coming back because they missed me. They were coming back because life had finally become difficult enough to remember I existed. Saturday arrived cold and grey, the kind of Illinois morning where the sky looks heavy enough to snow even if the forecast says otherwise. I woke up earlier than usual and cleaned the house even though it was already clean. Old habits die hard when family is involved. Part of me still remembered being the kind of mother who prepared snacks before Daniel came home from high school football practice, or baked cinnamon rolls before holiday visits. Love leaves routines behind long after people stop deserving them. Around 10:30, I saw Daniel's SUV pull slowly into my driveway. My stomach tightened unexpectedly as I watched them step out of the vehicle. Daniel looked exhausted. Not physically dirty or dramatic the way movies portray struggle, but worn down in quieter ways. His shoulders sagged slightly. His eyes looked tired. Megan climbed out a few seconds later wearing an oversized cream sweater and dark sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. For a moment, I stood behind the curtain watching them walk toward my front porch, and I realized how strange it felt to see them here after so many months of distance. Daniel knocked softly before opening the door with the spare key I had forgotten he still carried. "Hey Mom," he said carefully. I hugged him automatically because no matter how complicated things become, your body still remembers your child. Megan gave me a polite smile. "Your house looks beautiful," she said while glancing around the living room. I almost laughed at the irony. There had been a time when she subtly treated my modest home like some outdated relic compared to their sleek townhouse in Naperville. Now suddenly the hardwood floors and quiet rooms seemed comforting again. I made coffee while they sat at the kitchen table. The atmosphere felt awkward in a way family should never feel awkward. Like three co-workers trapped in a mandatory meeting pretending history did not exist. Daniel kept rubbing his hands together while Megan stared down at her coffee cup without drinking it. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. Things have been rough lately, he admitted quietly. Rough how? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He exchanged a quick glance with Megan before continuing. After Megan lost her job, we burned through savings faster than expected. Then my company cut overtime hours. Megan spoke for the first time since sitting down. The job market is terrible right now, she said defensively, almost like she expected judgment. I have sent out dozens of applications. I nodded calmly. I am sorry, things have been stressful. Another silence followed. Rain tapped lightly against the kitchen windows while the coffee machine hummed softly behind me. Finally, Daniel leaned forward in his chair. We are behind on some bills, he admitted. Mortgage payments. Credit cards. A few other things. There it was. The real reason for the visit, slowly stepping into the room. Not reconciliation. Not guilt. Need. I listened quietly while they explained rising expenses and financial pressure. Apparently, they had been living far beyond what either of them could comfortably afford for quite some time. Expensive vacations. Luxury furniture. Financed through monthly payments. Dining out several nights a week. Designer purchases carefully displayed online to maintain the image of success. The entire lifestyle suddenly sounded exhausting to me. At one point, Megan laughed nervously and said, honestly, we should have been more practical from the beginning. Practical. Interesting word coming from someone who once made my simpler life sound embarrassing. Then came the moment I had been expecting since they walked through the door. Daniel looked down at his coffee before speaking carefully. We were wondering if maybe you could help us out temporarily. Temporarily. Another carefully chosen word. How much help? I asked quietly. He hesitated before naming a number large enough to make my chest tighten. Nearly $20,000 between overdue bills and missed payments. I stared at him for a moment, stunned less by the amount itself than by the fact that they clearly expected me to rescue them after months of emotional abandonment. Megan suddenly leaned forward with surprising warmth in her voice. We would absolutely pay you back, she said quickly. This is just until things stabilize again. Stabilize again. As if life was simply going through a temporary inconvenience instead of exposing deeper truths. I looked at the two of them sitting across from me in my quiet kitchen, and suddenly memories started replaying one after another. The forgotten birthday. The empty Thanksgiving table. The unanswered phone calls. The fundraiser where I stood alone holding untouched cheesecake while Megan discussed healthy boundaries. Months of being treated like an emotional burden. And now here they were speaking softly to me again, because hardship had suddenly made family valuable. Daniel finally looked up at me with tired eyes. Mom, he said quietly, we really need help. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized the balance of power in the room had completely changed. The strange thing about power is that you do not truly understand who has it until someone becomes desperate. For over a year, I had sat alone questioning my worth while my son slowly drifted away from me. But sitting across from Daniel and Megan at my kitchen table that morning, listening to them explain overdue payments and financial pressure, I realized something neither of them had expected. I was no longer emotionally starving for their approval. And because of that, I finally had the ability to see them clearly. Daniel looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Megan looked uncomfortable, though she kept trying to maintain the polished composure she had always relied on. Every few minutes she tucked her hair behind her ear, or adjusted the sleeve of her sweater like someone trying to hold herself together through force of habit. I poured more coffee into their mugs before sitting back down quietly. I know this is a difficult situation, I said calmly. Daniel nodded immediately. It really is, Mom. Megan added softly, we have just been under a lot of stress lately. Stress? Another careful word. Nobody mentioned the months of silence. Nobody mentioned forgotten holidays or unanswered calls. Nobody acknowledged the distance that suddenly disappeared the moment they needed something from me. It fascinated me how easily people rewrite relationships once survival enters the picture. Daniel leaned forward again. We are not asking for charity, he said quickly. We would pay every dollar back. I studied my son's face while he spoke. He sounded sincere. That was the painful part. I do not think he fully understood how deeply he had hurt me because from his perspective, life had simply become busy and complicated. Meanwhile, I had spent nights sitting alone at an empty Thanksgiving table wondering how motherhood could slowly turn invisible. Megan finally looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. We really did not know who else to ask, she admitted quietly. Something about that sentence settled heavily inside me. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. After all the networking dinners and expensive lifestyles and carefully curated social circles, when real hardship arrived, none of those people were sitting here trying to help them. They had come back to the woman whose simple life they once quietly looked down on. I folded my hands together gently on the table. Can I ask you both something? Daniel nodded cautiously. Of course. I took a slow breath before speaking. Why did it take a financial crisis for you to remember I exist? The room became completely silent. Megan looked down immediately while Daniel blinked hard like he had not expected the question. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the windows while somewhere down the street a dog barked in the distance. Small ordinary sounds filling an uncomfortable silence. Mom, Daniel started quietly. But I shook my head softly. Not angrily. Just honestly. I spent holidays alone, I continued. I waited for phone calls that never came. I invited you into my life over and over again, until eventually I stopped because it hurt too much. Daniel stared down at the table. Megan looked visibly uncomfortable now, her polished confidence finally beginning to crack around the edges. It was never supposed to happen like that, Daniel muttered. I almost smiled sadly at those words, because pain rarely begins with evil intentions. Most family heartbreak happens through neglect. Through selfishness. Through people convincing themselves there will always be more time later. Megan finally spoke in a quieter voice than I had ever heard from her before. I think, maybe I encouraged too much distance, she admitted carefully. Daniel looked surprised by the confession, but she kept going. I grew up differently. My parents were never close with extended family, and sometimes I felt like Daniel relied on you emotionally in ways I did not understand. There it was at last. The truth hidden underneath years of polite smiles and subtle exclusion. I nodded slowly because strangely enough, hearing it out loud brought me peace instead of anger. And instead of talking to me honestly, I said gently, you both decided to slowly push me away. Neither of them answered because there was nothing left to deny. I looked at my son then, really looked at him, and suddenly I saw not just the man sitting in my kitchen, but the little boy who once cried after scraping his knee on our driveway because he thought pain meant abandonment. Somewhere along the way, adulthood had taught him that convenience mattered more than loyalty. But I had changed too. The woman sitting across from him now was no longer begging to be included in his life. Daniel, I said softly, I survived losing your father. I survived months of losing you too. And the hardest part is realizing I eventually learned how to live without needing either of you to choose me. His eyes filled slightly at that, and for the first time since arriving, he looked ashamed. After that conversation, nobody spoke for several seconds. The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle, and the quiet inside my kitchen felt heavier than any argument could have. Daniel looked down at his hands while Megan sat perfectly still beside him, her coffee untouched and growing cold. 4 years I thought closure would arrive dramatically, with raised voices, or some emotional confrontation, where everyone finally admitted what they had done to one another. Instead it arrived quietly in the same kitchen, where I used to pack my son's school lunches, and help him study spelling words at the table. Life has a strange way of bringing people back to the places they once stopped appreciating. Daniel finally cleared his throat. I know I have been distant, he said softly. I should have called more. More? Such a small word for such a large absence. I looked at him calmly and realized something surprising. I was no longer angry enough to punish him. But I also was not wounded enough anymore to rescue him at my own expense. There is a difference between forgiveness and returning to the same place that hurt you. I love you, I said quietly. You will always be my son. Daniel's eyes immediately filled with relief, but before he could speak again, I continued. But loving someone does not mean allowing them to disappear whenever life feels comfortable, and reappear whenever life becomes difficult. Megan looked down at the table again while Daniel swallowed hard. You are right, he admitted quietly. I nodded slowly. For a long time, I blamed myself for everything. I thought maybe I talked too much. Maybe I reached out too often. Maybe I expected too much from family. My voice remained calm, but each sentence felt honest in a way I had never allowed myself to be before. Then eventually I realized something painful. Healthy relationships do not make you beg to matter. Nobody interrupted me because deep down they both knew it was true. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen window for a moment. Outside, water dripped steadily from the gutters while fallen leaves clung to the wet driveway. Ordinary suburban life continuing quietly, while something important shifted inside our family forever. I cannot give you $20,000, I said gently without turning around. Behind me, the silence became immediate and sharp. Mom, Daniel started. I faced him calmly. I spent years sacrificing for this family. I helped pay for your college tuition after your father died. I refinanced this house once to keep us afloat during hard times. I worked overtime shifts at the medical office when I was exhausted because I wanted you to have stability. Daniel's face tightened with shame. And when life finally became comfortable for you, I continued softly, you slowly removed me from it. Megan suddenly spoke, her voice much quieter than before. We never meant to hurt you that deeply. I believed her. That was the tragedy of it all. Most people do not wake up planning to abandon someone who loves them. They simply become selfish little by little until kindness feels optional. I returned to the table and sat down again. I do not hate either of you, I said honestly. But I learned something important this past year. I survived losing my place in your life. And surviving it changed me. Daniel rubbed his eyes quickly before looking at me again. So that is it, he asked quietly. The sadness in his voice almost broke my heart, because suddenly he understood there are some distances you cannot fully undo once they happen. I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over his. No, I answered softly. This is not the end of our relationship. But it is the end of the version where I abandoned myself trying to keep you close. Tears slipped down his face then, and seeing my grown son cry nearly unraveled me completely. But for the first time in years, I did not rush to emotionally rescue him from discomfort. Sometimes people need to sit inside the consequences of their choices long enough to truly understand them. Before they left that afternoon, I packed leftovers into containers for them because caring for people had always been part of who I was. Megan hugged me at the front door longer than she ever had before. Her voice trembled slightly when she whispered, I really am sorry. I simply nodded because some apologies arrived too late to repair what was broken, even when they are sincere. After they drove away, the house became quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. Peaceful instead of lonely. A few weeks later, Daniel started calling more often. Not out of obligation. Not because he needed money. Sometimes just to ask how my garden was doing or whether I had gone to pottery class. The conversations remained careful at first, like two people learning a new language together, after years of misunderstanding each other. Trust does not return overnight. Neither does closeness. But one crisp October morning, I drove to the community center with Linda and the other women from church, while sunlight poured across the highway in long golden streaks. I remember looking out the window and realizing something simple but powerful. Some mothers lose their children to tragedy. I lost mine slowly to adulthood, marriage, pride, and convenience. But somewhere along the way, while grieving that loss, I finally found myself again.